So I would like to move on right now to Dr. Jessica Auchter, like I mentioned before, Political Science Department here at UTC. We'll ask her once again in a polite way to make those bullet points and make her points and hopefully take some Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It's been really interesting to hear all of the previous presenters and the discussion that's emerged from that. My talk, I guess, that I want to give actually speaks quite nicely to some of the issues that were just brought up. I want to talk a little bit about U.S. foreign policy and some of the questions that have arisen as a result of that, why we've seen the policies that we have seen, what kind of policies we might see in the immediate future as a result of some specific events that have already been mentioned, and then going off of the questions that were asked of the previous set of panelists, what kind of things individual Americans might be able to do to sort of pressure change and how we might see that kind of change to U.S. policy emerge. The first, I guess, my first bullet point that I want to address is just what U.S. foreign policy is usually based on. I think we tend to think of U.S. foreign policy as privileging things like democratization and human rights because that's the rhetoric that it's often couched in. But this is not usually the case. If you look at the way that foreign policy proceeds, it might not be a surprise to many of you, but there are often these sort of impetuses of stability and democracy that are in tension with one another, and typically the U.S. has almost always privileged stability over pursuit of democracy or protection of human rights, and I think that has really come into play in the Egypt context. So this is often called a realpolitik approach to foreign policy, just the privileging of self-interest, or in this case, strategic interest. So U.S. policy has been and likely will be centered in the future on how the U.S. defines its own strategic interests. One of the things that I'll mention at the end if I have time is things that individual Americans can do to get the U.S. or individual U.S. policymakers to redefine this concept of strategic interest. Because if we're functioning according to strategic interests, then changing how we understand our strategic interests might change what U.S. policy towards Egypt actually is based off of. I think that the desire for stability, though, has long underpinned a U.S. relationship with Egypt. It has underpinned the U.S.'s relationship with Mubarak in the past, and I think that it also explains why the U.S. has not come out with firmer statements than it did, which weren't really that firm, last summer when the military coup happened. I remember when I heard about the military coup, it was over that U.S. Independence Day holiday. I was with family. I received a notification on my smartphone about the coup, and I remember being shocked and going around telling all of my extended family that there had just been a military coup in Egypt, and no one really cared or knew what was going on. And I think that sort of typifies the kind of response that we saw in the U.S. at that point in time, and I think that the desire to sort of maintain some kind of stability and also U.S. perceptions of the Egyptian military colored our lack of significant response to the coup and our refusal to refer to it as a coup. So at the time, in the U.S., the way that the Arab Spring protest emerged as a whole in the context of Egypt was that the military was protecting the interests of the Egyptian people. This is something that was circulated in the media. So the average American's knowledge of Egypt, if they did have it, was centered around this notion that the military was protecting the Egyptian people. And I think to some degree that colored individual Americans' responses to this military coup then. If the military stepped in, it must have been something to do with protecting the people. And we've seen that rhetoric repeated again and again in the rhetoric of policymakers. It's something that John Kerry has said repeatedly. So I think that was the first obstacle to Americans and American policymakers calling it a coup, that their perception of the military was so strong, their relationship with the military was obviously quite strong as well historically, but their perception of the military's involvement in the original protests, that colored their perception then of this military coup. So there was a difficulty in understanding that the military perhaps was not acting in the interest of the people, or that the situation was a bit more complicated than it was being portrayed. So by the time this information emerges about the crackdown that's going on and the extensive human rights violations that the other panelists have already talked about, so I won't rehash, I think U.S. foreign policy was already sort of path-dependent, was already privileging stability, and was defining that stability and interest as a relationship with the military, and using rhetoric of the popular support to justify that they believed that the military had the support of the Egyptian people, whether or not that was actually the case. So I guess in the couple minutes that I have left, I want to, that'll be a couple minutes at least, okay. I wanted to address some of the examples that have been brought up previously, particularly about the death sentences that were recently issued to the 529 people as part of this sham trial, and kind of use that to pose some questions about giving U.S. aid that was already brought up by the previous panelists. The U.S. response to the death sentences that were handed down a couple of weeks ago has been, I would say, a little bit lukewarm. Both John Kerry and the State Department spokespersons have used the language of defying logic. The sentences defy logic. They've noted how shocked they were about the death sentences that have been handed down, and that they don't believe that the trials were in accordance with international norms or international law, which is sort of obvious when you have, as was stated earlier, 529 people sentenced in such a short period of time for the death of one police officer. So I think we can all agree that it defies logic, but at the same time, these sort of questions about how the U.S. then would respond to that, and I think that they have decided to respond by exerting pressure on the current government rather than to change this sort of due process and focusing on questions of due process, rather than focusing on this as one instance within a wider schema of more human rights violations. So they're focusing on the trials and the death sentences as one isolated event, and using that to try to pressure the current Egyptian government to change the way that they conduct trials, rather than viewing this widespread death sentence as symptomatic of a larger problem of widespread human rights violations that, as I said, everyone else has already documented. And the individuals who have directly suffered from these human rights violations are much better than I am at being able to describe how they're proceeding, so I won't even try to do that. But one thing I do want to point out is that I in particular and other human rights groups are especially concerned about is the way in which some of the crackdowns on the Muslim Brotherhood that we're seeing happening now are even more severe than the crackdowns on the Muslim Brotherhood that occurred under the Mubarak regime. That's very concerning. Yes. That the Brotherhood was outlawed right during certain portions of time under Mubarak, and obviously repression of opposition is one of the things that spurred democratic revolution in Egypt in the first place. But I think the hallmark of democracy is respect for the opposition. So when you call an opposition, when you call any political group in that country a terrorist group, and you have other groups that have claimed responsibility for the same acts that you're blaming that group for, then you have some concern. So if you don't have respect for opposition parties or multiple political parties, you don't have democracy. So I think the concern is that we're seeing even harsher and more widespread crackdowns against the Muslim Brotherhood than we saw even under Mubarak. That poses a lot of concerns. So then, just to address in my final moments this question of military aid and how some of these examples that I've talked about impact U.S. aid policy, I hate to be perhaps a little bit depressing in my conclusions here, but I'm not sure that we'll see changes right now. Some of the concerns, and the U.S. has been concerned about the situation in Egypt in the past. The last time that this discussion was had about giving military aid, the language of national security interest was used to overcome opposition in the U.S. government towards dispensing this aid. I think we'll see the same thing happening. John Kerry has said that the army acted the way it did to save democracy. He has not labeled it a coup. The language of the State Department has been that the relationship between the U.S. and Egypt is an important relationship. They don't want to sever relations. Relations means money, right? They don't want to sever those. So I think that the policy that we will see is this sort of pushing the Egyptian government to reconsider the way that it conducts trials, but not necessarily halting of military aid. At the same time, it is not all hopeless. So what can we do about that? I think there are two main things that tend to change US foreign policy. The first is public opinion. That can have a huge impact. So as individuals are, and everyone has sort of already discussed this, that there tends to be woeful lack of awareness of what's going on among average American citizens. So the more that that awareness can spread, the more likely it is that US policy will change. And also, changing US understandings of our own strategic interests is crucial to have a change in US policy. So I've said that the US operates privileging this idea that our national interest matters. The key then may be getting the US to define its national interest with regard to Egypt in a way different than it has in the past. And part of that may be reconsidering the relationship between the US and the Egyptian military in terms of the way that this perception often circulates, that the military necessarily speaks for the people of Egypt. So as that perception starts to change, with more awareness of what's going on there with the crackdown, then I think we may see US policy itself change. And that's the key to changing the way that aid is dispensed and that sort of thing. So I'll end there.
You were very kind, Dr. Auchter. Let's really show our appreciation for that great presentation. Again, I'm very embarrassed to ask our other two panelists to keep their speeches on the short demands of a parliament member of Egypt. But anyway, we'll get to that in just a minute. Dr. Auchter was mentioning so many things about John Kerry, and I remember when he found out about those 529 death sentences, he was so demoralized. He walked into a bar in Washington, and the bartender said, "Why the long face?" Get it, long face. Come on, I thought. And then I remember when Sadat was the president, you know, Mubarak was the vice president, right? And he went to India to visit Indira Gandhi when she was alive, right? So after 3 days in India, he returned to Cairo. He told his staff, go in the street, find me a red dot. I want to put that red dot right here. And his staff said, you know, usually the red dot is, you know, for Hindus, and you know, you're a Muslim, Arab guy. Why do you want the red dot? He said, well, when Mrs. Gandhi was waving goodbye in the Delhi airport, she said, Mr. Mubarak, you're a great man, you've got a great future, but one problem, you've got nothing here. All right, just trying to lighten up the atmosphere. I'm hoping that Dr. Khalid will translate this for our friends in Egypt, because this conference has the potential to go far and wide to bring this cause in front of the larger world community.